Good evening. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. I'm Pierre Chagnon, and I am the chairman of the Chautauqua Lake Protection and Rehabilitation Agency. This is public information meeting number 3. The objective of this meeting is to explain to the public the funding mechanisms that have been selected for evaluation. Based upon the feedback and input received tonight and over the next few days, the agency members will meet in a few weeks and select the preferred approach. For this meeting, there will not be any polling exercise like we've done in the past. As the presentation proceeds tonight, cards and pencils will be distributed to those in attendance here tonight to write down the questions you have. The cards will then be collected at the end of the presentation, and the questions will be answered and discussed. Everyone, including those watching this meeting remotely, are encouraged to provide feedback on the project website. I will now turn the meeting over to Project Manager Jamie Burchard. Jamie.
Thank you, Pierre. Good evening, everyone. As Pierre mentioned, my name is Jamie Burchard, and I will be conducting the first part of the presentation this evening, which is more of an overview and of what we've done to date. And then I will pass over the microphone to my remote colleagues. We have joining with us this evening Jack Williams, who's an environmental scientist, and also joined tonight is one of my team members, Dave Haney, who's a senior associate. So we've got 2 remote members, and I am here in person to, again, facilitate the conversation. So as a recap, as we said, moving forward, this is public information meeting number 3. Next slide, please. And our agenda for this evening entails an overview of what we've accomplished over the last few months. We will then dive into the current task on tonight's agenda, which is task number 3, which is the scope of work item number. Then we will also talk about the 3 selected approaches for examination. Again, up to this point, our team has really been working on research, data collection, and processing. So again, no decisions have been made. It's really been a research and data collection task to date. And then we will compare the 3 approaches. And then we'll revisit the next step so that everyone understands where we go from here tonight, when we will meet again as a group, and where we will basically go from December moving forward into the remaining project schedule. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've accomplished quite a lot here as we sit in December. We were supposed to meet 2 weeks ago, but we do feel fairly confident that we are still on schedule and can accommodate all of the tasks that you see outlined here in front of you. So as mentioned, we did have 2 committee workshops. So these are with the members of the CLPRA, 2 committee workshops in June and back in October. And then we've had our public information meetings as well. So the first one and the second one basically had the same content, and we were able to talk about the research and the data that was collected as part of task number 1, as you can see on the screen, which also presented the existing cost analysis of what the average annual spend across the watershed by various groups. And then which brings us here to task number 3, which is examining 3 select options for continued in-lake and watershed management activities. And then we'll move forward with the recommendations and the final and draft report. Next slide, please. So we've done a summary of the watershed and have collected all of the data, the studies, and the research to date that have been accomplished across the watershed and put together an infographic, which will be collected and put into the report. Next slide. We've collected, again, that cost analysis, which is gathering through interviews and talking with the various organizations in the watershed of what their spend on implementation activities, with the annual average spend about $3.2 million. Next slide. And then we also provided a very holistic overview of the various options that are available to examine a long-term funding strategy. So think of it as a research project looking at, again, the idea of having taxing districts, so whether it be near lake or watershed, looking at user impact fees, and then also looking at boat user fees. All of this will be written up and the research will be provided in that final draft and final reports. As part of the project, we do have two components, which essentially looks at the funding analysis, which will be the main objective of this evening's presentation. But coinciding with that analysis is also a legal analysis. So understanding how we can use the current regulatory mechanisms. So we're looking at the county law and town law right here, as you can see in front of you. And both of these are existing regulatory mechanisms that allow for basically the establishment of special districts, which collect fees to create implementation activities for various number of projects, depending on what the district is created for. You might have heard it for whether it be a business improvement district or a drainage district. This is a fairly popular tool that's used across New York State, and it can be used by county and town jurisdictions. What we are examining is the idea of possibly looking at the creation of special legislation if what we are looking at proposing doesn't exactly exist in current regulatory tools, which looks at the idea of a hybrid approach, looking at both the county and the town law across and looking at creating activities that would match with near lake district and a watershed district. So where we currently stand on that legal analysis has been the recommendation to put forward an opinion, to ask for an opinion for the New York State Attorney General's office. We're not there yet to ask for an opinion on whether there is potential to create special legislation if it doesn't exist in current New York State law. We are not there yet to make that request. As we move forward in our process, which is tonight, we're listening to public feedback, as well as, again, anticipated meetings with the CLPRA. When we identify the selected approach and we identify those lake or those in-lake and watershed projects for implementation, we will have more information to be better able to put forward that question moving forward. Next slide, please. And to address some of the common questions that we've heard at past public information meetings, why are we not looking at a county-wide approach? So just very quickly, we did address some of these questions on our project website through the Q&A section. But again, we are here to solely focus our efforts on Chautauqua Lake, which only concerns a certain amount of municipalities in the county. And under existing law, local funding mechanisms must be based on the fact that there are benefits or impacts. So whether that be the creation of activities, so like for example, for a business improvement district, those funds would be used for the betterment of that district, or like a drainage district where there are impacts being felt to create basically a funding mechanism to create activities to reduce the impacts on that particular area. And not all communities are obviously located in the watershed for Chautauqua Lake, so they do not receive direct benefits, nor do they directly impact the lake. So that is why we are not examining that countywide approach. So with that, we are going to get into task number 3, which goes through those select funding mechanisms. And I will pass the microphone over to my colleague, Jack Williams, and he will go through what will be a lot of information. So please, we're happy to take your questions, but we encourage you to listen intently and before you start to ask questions or think of them right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie. So before we get into some of these specific funding mechanisms that we are going to talk about here, I just want to run over kind of some of the primary goals that we were focusing on during mechanism selection and some of the primary considerations we were looking at. So the overall goal here is to find what is both the most effective and the most equitable funding mechanism for the establishment of the Lake District. And as far as the primary considerations, first and foremost, we're looking to see which properties receive the greatest benefits from the establishment of the Lake District. And what goes hand in hand with that is looking at what properties contribute to the pollutant loading most, who is sharing a part in those impacts. What data is available for each approach? This is a feasibility piece of developing these. And then the legal feasibility, which Jamie has already touched on. Based off of some of those legal components and the differences in the benefits received and the contributions to pollutant loading, we have started with some preliminary tiers here as far as what is within the study area. We have 3 total tiers, and they start with tier 1, those that have direct lake frontage. And those are going to be the ones that we see as receiving the most benefits. A lot of this comes from the legal standing pieces. Tier 2 similarly does have direct private lake access. The difference between that and Tier 1 is that they do not have any direct frontage. And Tier 3 is the remainder of that contributing drainage area. The rest of the properties that are within the watershed, which do share in contributions to the lake, but there is a slight difference as far as the benefits received from the development of a lake district. These are just a couple figures showing you which parcels, as far as this preliminary analysis goes, are included within each tier. And then we just wanted to touch briefly on the funding utilization piece as far as the end goals of this. What is this money going to go toward? And similar to the distribution of the tiers, we have broken down the allocation of this funding for some different uses, starting with in-lake maintenance. These are going to be projects and initiatives that are going to directly go toward providing better water quality within the lake directly. And then we also have non-point source stormwater and watershed pollution controls. And these are going to be a little bit more of the preventative maintenance pieces within the greater watershed area to try and reduce that pollutant loading as much as we can. And there are some miscellaneous pieces, and these certainly could fall in some of the other buckets here, but these would be things like educating the public on best management practices, completing monitoring activities and conservation projects. And we'll get into those a little bit more as we get toward the end here. So as far as selecting a strategy, the first one, as we said, we want to make sure this is something equitable. We want to make sure that people are paying based off of those benefits achieved and those contributions provided. Feasibility, we need to make sure that this is something legally achievable, going back to some of the legal pieces that Jamie has already discussed. We wanted to make sure that we were looking at mechanisms that had precedent as successful previously used methods, both in the ability to be implemented and to be coordinated moving forward and ultimately result in pollutant reductions within the lake. And part of that is also the consideration of implementation and operation costs. We want to make sure that whatever money you would ultimately end up with in a lake district is going toward the lake more so than the management. So that gets us to the 3 funding mechanisms that we have evaluated, and we will talk about each of these in detail, and we will give some examples, some pros and cons of each, and try to give you the full picture so everybody can start leaning towards some preferences here. And it's important to note at this point that the purpose of this presentation is to illustrate how each of these mechanisms work. The figures that we're looking at, some of the scoring criteria, the contribution monetary totals, the statistics between different contributions are all theoretical at this stage, and that is just due to those different gaps in available data that would be built out as a mechanism is selected, and some more time would go into them to make sure that they are looking far closer to what they would look like in actuality. So we just ask that you keep that in mind here as we run through each of these. So we will start with the most basic of the 3 approaches, and that is the tiered flat fee. Under this approach, we would take the different total allocations of the total funding goal that would be divided between each tier. Again, those would be considered based off the total number of properties within that tier, as well as those benefits and contributions. And then that is just divided evenly between each one. It does not take into account any variables of land use or any of the activities going on with any specific parcel. This is just within that tier, an even split of all the money. And you can see on this table here, we have what a flat fee would be based off of a theoretical $10 million funding goal, which we began with based off of that preliminary cost analysis that we looked at as far as what we're using right now and what we need to really make a major difference in the lake. As I mentioned before, you'll see that the funding goals are going to be different between the tiers. Just something to clarify is that keep in mind the different numbers of parcels. Just because tier 1 has a lower total funding goal, you'll see that the tiered flat fee is the largest amongst them due to the lesser number of parcels. The second approach begins a little bit similar, but it brings some different variables into account. And this is a formula-based fee. And this is where we would look at a number of different property variables. This could be as simple or as complex as ultimately would be desired during further stages of evaluation. And these are just some examples of different variables that could be selected based off of the potential for driving non-point source pollutant contributions. The figure showing some of the difference in land use and one of the variables that would more than likely be considered as a part of this approach. The general steps involved in this are fairly simple. It is a two-step process, with step one being taking those tiered flat fee based contributions, essentially saying what would the contribution per parcel be on an annual basis, split evenly between that funding allocation goal. Step two is where these different variables come into play. And each of these, again, these different scores are here just for illustrative purposes, and these would be looked at in much greater detail as far as relating each of these scores to one. So a score of less than one, we are saying that this is a land use or an area, whatever that variable is, that is more beneficial compared to your standard parcel. And those that have a higher likelihood of pollutant contributions would have a multiplier greater than one, so that we are making sure that those contributions annually from a monetary standpoint are similar to those from a pollutant loading standpoint. The tool that we have developed for this is set up to be able to track statistics. And as I mentioned, these are not by any means the numbers that you would be looking at in the end. These are all just illustrative, but the purpose of this is just to show that as those variables that we looked at on the previous slide are tweaked, in this case, we're looking at a fairly simple version where we were just looking at area and land use. We can see what those averages are, what the maximums are, what the minimums are, and make sure that scoring is done accordingly to make sure that, again, this is an equitable solution. So now let's just run through a theoretical example. We are going to be looking at a theoretical residential property in Tier 1 that totals 1.3 acres. So from the first step, the tiered flat fee approach, we have the base contribution for this formula approach as $793 based off of the tier location. We would then look at the land use, which is residential, and we have this as an even score of 1 in this theoretical example. We would then pull in the area component, and at 1.3 acres, we would be in this 1 to 3 acre range. Again, those would be subject to change. And from there, you would take the base contribution, you would multiply it by both of those multipliers, and you would end up with the contribution changed based off of those different scoring variables. The third and final approach that we are going to discuss is the equivalent residential units. This is one that has been fairly common in case studies that we have looked at. And what the equivalent residential unit I'll be referring to as an ERU is a standardized method of equating different property types with different land uses, different pollutant potentials to one another using one single variable. And the variable that is used for this is the impervious cover at each property, and ultimately for non-residential properties, the average impervious cover for a residential property is sort of the baseline, and that will make a little more sense as we start to get through some examples here. Before we jump into the example, I'd just like to discuss a little why impervious cover is going to be the primary and lone variable for this method. And what we mean by impervious surfaces are areas that do not infiltrate water. These are hard surfaces that are going to increase runoff discharge and lack that natural filtration that areas allowing runoff to soak in provide. And these are areas such as roofs, driveways and roads, gravel surfaces, any hard surface that water will not soak into. And as I mentioned, that is just going to speed up the rate of runoff. It is going to increase the amount of runoff, and it's going to take away some of that natural filtration. So definitely seen as one of the most important drivers of non-point source and stormwater pollution. The general process involved in this is first to determine the average impervious cover for a residential property. Step 2, you determine the total number of ERUs within the watershed. Step 1 being figuring out what one equivalent residential unit is, that average number. Step 3, you then determine the cost of the equivalent residential unit determined in step 1, and you are going to divide the total number of ERUs determined in step 2 by your total funding goal to determine the cost associated with each one. And we'll walk you through an example now to show you how these work. In this example, we are going to be looking specifically at Tier 1. Again, similar to the rest of these, this would, as far as these examples, we have broken it out between each tier to show the potential to do that in the future. And based off the preliminary data that we have, we estimated that Tier 1 includes just shy of 9 million square feet of hard impervious cover. Based off of previous case studies and the data that we have, we, for this example, have determined that the average residential property, for the sake of discussion, will be assumed to contain approximately 2,000 square feet of impervious cover. So dividing that by the total, we determine that there are just over 4,300 equivalent residential units within the Tier 1 study area. So with a total Tier 1 funding goal under these examples of $2 million, we would divide that $2 million by those equivalent residential units, and we would determine that each equivalent residential unit, each one of these properties with 2,000 square feet or greater of impervious cover, for every 2,000 square feet, it would be $450 for that ERU base rate. And now to show you an example, I know we have determined this based off of the average residential property, but to show you how this method compares other property types to a residential property, we'll look at a theoretical commercial property that includes 6,000 square feet of impervious cover. Based off of 6,000 square feet and one ERU being 2,000 square feet from that residential average, this commercial property contains 3 ERUs within this example. At a base cost of $458 per ERU, the annual contribution here for this commercial property would be $1,374. Similar to the formula approach, we have this set up to view some statistics here, and this is what helps us identify data gaps, see what would need to be built up for future examples. As you can see, we have some inflated maximums here due to these data gaps, and as we refine the data, these would most certainly go down, and there would also be the potential to discuss some level of a cap system to be implemented to avoid these inflated contributions and have some level of a cap, with the understanding that then that would be allocated elsewhere. So implementation and operation is the next piece to discuss as far as the comparison of each of these. We've already discussed some of the data involved in it, some of the different variables that they look at, and where they stand as drivers of non-point source pollution. And so the biggest one as far as the implementation and operation, of course, as you can see after discussing the ERU piece and the formula approach, is the available data. Aiming to avoid needing to, canvass door to door and what can we see and what can be processed here based off of data that is either open source or able to be requested. Reevaluation over time for at least the formula approach and the equivalent residential unit is going to be another major consideration, and that is just because there's going to be changes within the study area. There's going to be new development. There's going to be old properties that may be purchased for conservation, and some of those, if there's going to be pieces of this where there would be the potential for incentives that you could do at your home that would reduce your overall impact and therefore your overall cost, these would be refactored in during that reevaluation over time on some level of a rotating basis over a multiple year period. And the third one is project planning, implementation, operation, and maintenance, and the ongoing administration costs. This is, what is required to take this money, take the projects and initiative goals that we have, and actually put them into place to do some good for the lake. Now that we've discussed some of the differences between each approach, some of the factors that we need to consider as far as implementation and limitations, we've pulled together just a basic comparison table here just to discuss some of the pros and cons as you think about it tonight and beyond, for everybody to help kind of zero in on their preferred approach. And we'll start with the tiered flat fee. The primary benefit of this one is that it is the simplest approach, and it limits that need for future reanalysis unless there was a division of parcels. Overall, the change in variables at a specific property would not require a reanalysis of the cost. The limitation, of course, of this one being that this does not account for variation between parcels, and a very small undeveloped parcel within the same tier would be subject to the same contribution as a larger developed or different land use. And because of the lack of variables included in this, there are no notable data gaps for us to discuss here. For the formula approach, one benefit of this is that it is able to be tailored to the largest number of variables. It allows us a greater ability to tailor this to the study area, to the preferences of the different stakeholders. And it is a generally simple approach, and it is a simple approach to convey and explain and make sure everybody is on board. But it does have its limitations as far as reanalysis over time, as we've discussed. The collection of data, of course, the more variables we have, the more data collection that is needed, the more reanalysis that is needed. There's a high level of complexity with this. It does not automatically base itself around that overall funding goal. So if we were determined, for example, that a certain land use, let's say agricultural or conservation properties, should have a multiplier far less than 1, overall that another multiplier would need to be increased, and it's kind of finding that happy medium and making sure that it's that equitable solution. So there's a little bit of legwork there, which administratively could lead to some time. Data gaps, we do not have high resolution impervious cover data as mentioned during the ERU overview, and there are minor gaps in parcel data and land use codes and just some things that would need to be ironed out before implementation. For the ERU approach, the primary benefit of this one is its precedence as being accepted, as being effective, as being able to be implemented. A few of the case studies that we have looked at are Burlington, Vermont, and Ithaca, New York. We have seen this common in other states as well. And the other benefit of this is that it is directly related to the amount of development on the site, which, as I mentioned, is fairly accepted as one of the primary drivers of pollutant contributions. And the way that this is set up, it will always provide the full funding goal. It will always distribute that based off of which percentage of the total development within the study area a certain property accounts for. And it will always add back up to that total and take out some of the legwork that the formula approach would have, where you need to make sure that as one variable is reduced in its priority, another one needs to be increased. Similar to the formula approach, this requires reanalysis over time as there's development within the watershed, and there are those administrative limitations, data collection, processing, those type of things. And then for the data gaps, the main one here, with there being only one variable, is going to be that high resolution impervious cover data. So now that we have gone over each of these and everybody will have some time to digest it, I will talk a little bit about what the funding mechanism selection process is and some of the pieces that go into that. The first piece is going to be just from an initial overview, what are the preferences as far as each different mechanisms, and which one do stakeholders prefer to prioritize. As a mechanism is zeroed in on, the next step would be to finalize the funding goal overall and determine what that split would be between tiers as well. In addition to that, you would need to determine which pieces of that overall funding would go toward in-lake maintenance, toward those watershed preventative maintenance pieces. The third step, once a funding goal is finalized and we have started to zero in on a preferred mechanism, is to determine potential sources for that missing or low resolution data and figure out how we can fill in those data gaps to make it as accurate a representation of the study area as possible. Step 4 would be to determine the future effort required for implementation, both implementation of the mechanism itself, as well as we discussed before, the implementation of each of these projects. And the last piece is the evaluation of supplemental funding opportunities that could be tied into this. One that we have discussed and does require some further evaluation is boat user fees to try to pull in different users of the lake who are achieving benefits and are achieving use of the lake but may not live within the study area. And another one, and a very important one for the potential development of a lake district, is grant funds. Grant funds, as I'm sure you know, have been a big part of work that has already been done within the watershed. But a lake district and the development of a lake district is a very important and beneficial way to leverage grant funds and to be able to pull more grant funds in based off of the money that is being expended from within the study area itself. And with that, we are going to jump into the next steps, and I am going to pass the mic back over to Jamie to talk about some scheduling and some upcoming components of this.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Excuse me. So where we are right now is we've got our project schedule. So this is pulled right out of our scope of work. So you can see that red arrow, we are at the component where we are, will be having a next project team meeting with our essential core group after we have our public information meeting, and then moving forward into, well, it was supposed to be November, but we're December. We had a little snowstorm here. So, but we will be moving ahead, and we are on track to finish this project, again, looking at to spring time frame. So again, this information is available on the project website. So next slide, please. Okay, if you can back up, please. Maybe Jack, if you can read it, because I can't read it from my spot either, but Oop, Jack, are you still there?
Yep. So for today's meeting, we have, if you see that red arrow, we are listed as meeting number 4 for the project team. Public information meeting number 2, with the next step in later on in December would be the preparation of the draft phase 1 study report. Following completion of the draft phase 1 study report, we would be heading into the committee workshop number 3 to discuss what has been pulled together for the study report and the preferences so far. And that is where we would head into public meeting number 3 in December, and finally in March, the preparation of the final phase 1 study report.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. This slide right here will tell us our immediate next steps and our meeting goals of where we go from here this evening. So as we are in our third information meeting, the information that has been presented to you this evening, we fully expect to have comments and to receive feedback from everyone, but you might need some time to digest it. It's a lot of information that was presented here tonight. So we understand that we will be coming back and meeting with the CLPRA members in December to review the feedback that we've heard tonight, and that has also been presented and collected from the project website. From there, a decision will be made in January of which of the 3 approaches that were reviewed this evening will be examined for further detail and study. So some of that red language that you saw up on the screen tonight, we will be able to do more of a deeper dive and flesh out the selected approach from that point. So again, we have this evening, December 1st, moving into, again, December later end of the month to meet with the CLPRA to review the feedback, and then a decision will be made in January of which one of those approaches will be kind of doing a deeper dive and filling out some of those gaps for. And then we will be returning back to the public to present some of the findings, again, from that at that 4th public information meeting. But again, we encourage you to use the project website. So there is the, hopefully, I think the URL will work, but a public information flyer was distributed with the QR code. So if you use your phone, it'll take you right to the project website, or you can copy it down right here. It's very long. It's bartonlejudis.mysocialpinpoint.com. Well, let me see if we can. It works. So there's a QR code right there. You can just kind of take the picture, and it'll bring you right to the link on your phone. But it's bartonlejudis.mysocialpinpoint/chautauqua-co-lake-fund. But you can use your phone, and you should be able to download the QR code right there. So it'll take you right to the project website. And we can come back to this screen if you want to get up close and take a picture of it.
Sure.
Okay. Did you get the website? Okay. We'll go ahead, move ahead. So when you get to the project website and you go to the bottom of the page there'll be a section that you can submit feedback. And that's where you can basically provide feedback on the 3 boxes. So right here, you can see the first one. I have to use the microphone. So you've got the first tiered flat fee, and then you've got the formula-based fee, and then you've got the ERU. So you've got those 3 options to put your comments regarding those 3 formula that we talked about, because that's what we want feedback about, is your feedback about those particular funding mechanisms. And then the bottom one, the orange one, is what additional comments do you have? So those are 3 spaces for you to use that platform to record your feedback. Next slide. And then we also have members of the CLPRA with us in the audience this evening, and this is just an opportunity for you to, again, engage in conversation and dialogue with any of those members to provide feedback in that way as well. So we did provide note cards. So if we can go ahead and collect those, we'll run through and answer the questions. But I can back up 2 slides if folks want to get to that QR code again, since that was, yep. So you could, if you just want to walk right up there and use your phone, you can get right to the project website. Then you can link it and send it. Yep, open up your camera, get really close. Nope. Did it work?
Well, I took a picture of it.
Oh,
but I
here,
don't
let me
know
show
what's
you.
On that.
You go right over here. Okay, here. See how it, see that? Are you on your camera? Yes, on my camera. So, just do that. There we go. You got it.
I think I gotta have something on my phone.
Sure. Do you want to read them? Do you want to read them?
I can, if you'd like.
Do you want to read them? And then I can, okay. I figure you can use your discretion and maybe answer ones that you feel pertain more to the county.
Yep.
Okay. Is this mic on, Courtney? Is this mic on?
It is. We can hear you through that mic.
I didn't hear like my echo.
pouring in. Thank you. Okay, we've got some questions, and I am going to read them, and Jamie or myself will attempt to answer the questions, and then we can discuss what the answers are. So, they keep pouring in. How are parcels decided in Tier 3?
Jack, I think that's one of your questions.
Sure. The determination of which parcels were included in Tier 3 were based off of those that did not have any lake access. And the external boundary, the further away from the lake boundary, is the drainage divide for areas where all drainage would be contributed to the lake. For the sake of consistency with previous reports, the data that was presented tonight was based off of the same drainage area boundary that was used for the initial watershed management plan for the lake.
So a property in Tier 3 is any property within the overall Chautauqua Lake watershed that doesn't have a direct lake frontage or lake access, but it's within the watershed itself.
Okay, the next question is, who administers the funding mechanism? And I think I can address this one. If the Lake District is formed, the Lake District will have an administrative board to be determined, and that administrative board would administer the funding that's collected. That's all to be determined. There's a lot of to be determined in there. The next question. How would we enforce boat fees? And I think that depends upon if we are successful in getting state approval to enact boat fees. That would be part of the approval that we are granted as to how it would be enforced. But again, that is another to be determined because we cannot control directly the imposition of boat fees. That would need state approval. Next question. How can the funding mechanism incentivize property owners to engage in best lake stewardship practices? Theoretically, if all properties so engaged, wouldn't the total expenditure decline?
Jamie, I can take that
Yep,
one if
go
you'd
ahead.
like.
Go ahead, Jack.
As far as the incentives for other best management practices, that is something that would certainly be considered under any of these approaches, and it is something that we have seen included in previous case studies. So again, as far as the what that would look like and how would come after selection of a mechanism, but that is certainly something that has been discussed and would be evaluated in greater detail as we started moving toward a final selection.
Thank you, Jack. Next question. Do you have an estimate or at least some hypothetical figures on the amount of revenue that would come from boat user fees? And at this point, we have talked about in previous meetings a couple of different levels that the boat user fee could be placed at to get reactions from the community, but I don't think we're at the stage yet to even throw out hypothetical figures. Agreed?
Agreed.
And could that revenue, again from boat user fees, from that revenue, be supplemented by one or more of the tier plans?
I don't know, Jack, if you have any thoughts on this. I know that we started to look at the data for estimating and tracking boats on the lake, and that is something that we have not pursued because, well, we have asked for some of the data, but it's not consistent. There's only one spot that actually takes in the amount of boats on the lake that we are aware of at this time. So again, it's really more of a data analysis and availability of that information. So for us to move forward in that direction would require more digging. So again, we need that feedback from the CLPRA of what methods to pursue, and then we can move ahead and get that additional information.
Agreed. Not much to add there other than, as you mentioned, part of it would be based off which process was overall selected and starting to determine that line between users of the lake who may already be in that tier one and may already be contributing, and would that be included, or is the goal for this to be those that are outside the study area as well? So as you mentioned, just at this point, more data needing to be gathered and seeing what piece of the total pie that would potentially make up.
Okay, Jack, I think this next question is for you as well. With the
All right.
formula-based option, ag and residential have the same loading. Is the greater impact from ag expected to be accounted for with the area score?
That absolutely would. If you recall back to the slide that I had, much of this was in an effort to have the numbers workable from this preliminary phase of the study, and those numbers would realistically likely look much different from there. And there's a few things that would need to go in to this question's point: the difference in residential loading versus agricultural loading, the difference in some different property uses, as far as potential conservation credits. Would there be incentives for agricultural land to be able to reduce theirs based off of an approved agricultural management plan? So it is a great question. It is certainly something that we have thought in detail about, and that would more than likely be the case as far as potentially a higher baseline for agricultural, but similar to each of these property uses, with the potential for incentives that could reduce those based off of best management practices.
Okay, the next question. Will the final funding mechanism be subject to a public vote? Most of the arrangements that we are considering are under either county or town law, and those would be subject to a permissive referendum. However, when the county legislature makes the decision on whether they are going to proceed with forming the district, they would have the option of having a required referendum, not just be subject to permissive. So that would be determined at the time that the legislature, if they make the decision to form the district, they would have the option of making it a required referendum, or if they choose not to do that, it would certainly be subject to a permissive referendum, unless we're dealing with some special legislation from the state, and then who knows what that might require. Next question. How did $3.2 million spend get increased to $10 million plus or minus?
We chose amongst the project team $10 million as a place to start, and to again have feedback from the public to understand what we need to go for. And one of the ideas we talked about as the project team was to really have a good understanding of what is being accomplished now in the lake. Is it successful? And other projects that we could try to take on that cost a lot of money. And some of those discussions have included the idea of perhaps dredging, which is a fairly expensive activity. So with increasing the annual spend to a greater number, greater achievements can be succeeded with. So that was a number that we decided upon, and to go from there, but to really be progressive and try to go after projects that and implementation items that have not been done before because of the lack of funding. So that was, again, discussed with the project team and is up for discussion with the CLPRA.
Next question. What properties will carry exemptions? For example, village, town, state-owned properties, veterans, service clubs, etc.
Jamie, I can jump in here
Yeah.
again if you'd like. These are all things, especially at the baseline stage of pulling all these together, that were discussed in detail, and we would have very much liked to include those in these preliminary examples. There's just a lot of legwork determining what As Pierre has mentioned, part of this may come down to what way an approval was granted. So the short answer is that that is to be determined, but something that will certainly be a large topic of discussion as we zero in on one specific mechanism, and then certainly after mechanism selection.
Okay, Jack, since you're on the to be determined clause, the next question is, will ERUs or formula funding mechanism take into account meadow and forest are more permeable than residential and commercial lawns?
Yes and no. So it would all depend on what variables are associated within it. The ERU method, with the fact that it is only looking at impervious cover and just those developed surfaces, that one would not look at a difference between those undeveloped cover types that you may have on a property. The formula approach is one that would have the ability to include that within it, and that land use variable could be broken out as complex or as simple as preference and feasibility determines, but just with the caveat that the more variables that are included, the more difficult or potential hurdles there are during implementation as well as reevaluation. So I think as far as the formula approach, being able to include it is certainly something that is in the mix, but it would just be finding that fine line between how sensitive is it to those differences, and is it financially worth the extra implementation and reevaluation?
Thank you. So the next question is, Tier 1 and Tier 2 property numbers, the number of parcels, how are these counts determined, and what criteria differentiates a Tier 1 and a Tier 2?
That one is going to be based solely on if the property has direct lake frontage. The piece that Tier 1 and 2 share in common is that they do have some level of direct lake access that is not a public lake access, such as a park or a commercial property. The difference being that Tier 1, the property itself has frontage of the lake, and Tier 2 does not, aside from that access point.
Okay, next question. Where will the funds be held? A separate fund that is protected from general use by the county? And I think that the answer to that is that if a district is formed, it would be managed and run the same as a water district or a sewer district, of which the county has several, that the funds that are collected from those users can only be used for projects or uses within those districts. So the money would be held separate and distinct for the Lake District, just as the funds for the sewer districts and water districts are held separate and distinct for those districts. Next question. If the lakefront property owners are already paying higher taxes, why not use part of that rather than tax them again? And I think that that's a question that the CLPRA has struggled with, and that is certainly going to be something that is taken into consideration when the legislature considers forming the district or not. Okay. How are the parcels decided in Tier 3?
I believe this is one we've gone over a bit before, but it's just those that are within the Chautauqua Lake watershed, but that do not have any of direct private lake access or frontage.
Okay. Next question. What will you spend the tax money on? Still never discussed at these meetings. How much of this tax will be spent on annual basis? Will the board get a salary? Those are all questions that will have to be determined if a district is formed. As I said earlier, if the district is formed, it will be administered by a administrative board, is the way that I envision it at this point. There are options to that, but our sewer districts and our water districts are administered by a board. So that board would then be tasked with the responsibility of deciding how the money would be spent. And our administrative boards for our sewer districts and our water districts that have been in place for many years are all on a volunteer basis. None of those board members are paid anything. Okay, next question. That one's been answered already. Okay, this is more of a comment that whatever fee structure you use, no one should be exempt, including nonprofits. Okay. Is there another question in here? Okay. With the passage of the $4 billion Bond Act on November 8th, 2022, is it necessary to raise the full $10 million estimated to fund the projects for Chautauqua Lake protection and rehabilitation, since the money that will be raised by the state is destined for projects such as this one?
So again, that $10 million amount is still open for feedback. And again, we use that number to really be able to scope out projects that were not being accomplished with the current spending that's going on in the lake. And to have more of a local structure again for Chautauqua Lake. I'm not sure if...
Let's say it's annual, 10 million annually. That the billions that they're talking about there could be for one-time projects for now, but it's not ongoing.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's not an ongoing. So this would be more of a a funding mechanism that would last and be continuing forward. So.
Jamie, one other point to add there, going back to the piece on being able to leverage local money, as far as being able to find future grant opportunities and not sticking to just those that have been exhausted already, the more local dollars that are able to be put in and is determined to be feasible, the better opportunity to leverage for other government funds too.
Right. I mean, an issue that usually comes up with grant applications is finding the local match. So this source of funding could be able to be used for that.
Okay, are there any other questions that we haven't collected? Please do.
Speak into them.
Speak into the microphone so those online can hear you as well.
You said that the funding goal is going to determine which option is selected. And we've been talking about how to get from 3.5 to 10. And the funding goal, to me, you have to take into account the Chautauqua Lake and Watershed Alliance, all the other associations that already have initiatives going on. Don't you have to resolve the position of this alliance with those to know what your funding goal is? Are they going to be integrated? Is this going to be overarching? Are their initiatives going to be independent? Doesn't that play into what funding method we use?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and the answer to your question is yes, but it's not a simple process. So the funding goal that we're talking about is just a round number, $10 million. Should that be $7 million or $9 million or 11? All to be determined. And could that funding goal change over time? Could it go up, down, sideways? Certainly. But those are all questions that we would have to wrestle with before the legislature would approve creation of a district, certainly.
So you haven't resolved whether this is going to be an overarching motherhood of all alliances or just a separate one on its own, or?
Well, just to clarify, what we're talking about is creation to do is that there are other funds that have been generated every year. And would these funds from this district be supplemental to those or replace some of those? And that's the to be determined, really. Yep. Good question, though. Thank you. Is that mic on? Yep.
I have a real simple,
Mic's on, Jim.
okay. Yeah, real simple question. I think there was a request that we provide some comments, one of those charts. To do that, we need the charts that we saw tonight. Many of them weren't readable from back here. And if we're going to give good input, like you requested, we got to have the charts. Where do we get them?
So this presentation will be posted on the project website, and you can go back and review the charts that were in the presentation.
Okay, and are the charts from the previous presentations out there? Because I've never been able to find them. Each meeting we ask about that, and they say they're going to be put out, but
Is on the project website, along with the other requests such as the scope of work, frequently asked questions, list of the CLPRA members. So the reason that this presentation has not been made public was we wanted to have this meeting first, and now it will be posted on the project website.
so like tomorrow or?
Sure,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Other questions? Looks like everybody's looking forward to seeing the Bills play tonight.
Yeah, go Bills.
Jamie, anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you for your attendance and for your participation and for your excellent questions. We appreciate the feedback, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you.